Hello everybody. I want to make a video on the ethical case uh, against the legal measures introduced by the government to suppress the circulation of the coronavirus. Um, uh, there are two schools of thought, broadly speaking, in the coronavirus debate. Um, we have what I might call the COVID suppressionists, and they favour radical new legal rules which are designed to suppress the spread of the virus, probably until a vaccine is available. That's one school of thought. And then we have what I've called the COVID permissivists, which is probably a terrible name for it, but anyway. Um, and broadly speaking, in this camp in which I am, we believe that we have to allow or permit the virus to circulate in wider society whilst taking targeted measures to protect the old and the vulnerable. And in this talk, what I want to do is to try and articulate the ethical case for COVID permissivism, or you might want to call it the ethical case against lockdown. Um, in doing so, it's an ethical case that I want to make, not so much a legal case. But in doing so, I have a certain audience in mind. My audience is the 99.999% of the population who try to live by widely accepted ethical precepts, the maxims that regulate civilized societies everywhere. Not controversial moral principles, but ones on which I hope we can all agree, conservative or socialist or whichever political viewpoint we have. Basic things that we should do good to humankind in general and to our family and to our friends in particular. That we have special duties of care to our parents and to our elders, as well as to our children and our posterity. That justice should be upheld in our personal relationships with one another, in our business affairs, in our legal, economic, and political systems, and that things like hard work, good faith, truthfulness, mercy, courage, and kindness of spirit are good things that are to be welcomed. I'm going to call these uncontroversial, I hope, ethical principles the code. It's just a shorthand term that I intend to use. I might just as easily have said common decency or traditional morality or something like that. By the way, those people who don't feel bound by the code include psychopaths, tyrants, ideological fanatics of one sort or another, people who are very seriously mentally ill, infants below the age of 2 or 3. I've got very little to say to any of those groups. This is an ethical talk, but it presupposes that people listening share broadly a commitment to basic standards of normal, decent behaviour. I'm not saying that the rest of us always live up to the code, but we know that we ought to. And if you count yourself in that number, then this talk is intended for you. So here's the ethical case for suppressing the spread of the virus. This would be the government position, the government of much of the media, and the commentariat, who seem to me to have an unshakable confidence that they occupy the ethical high ground in this whole debate. They say that the code is on their side. They say that to recklessly or selfishly make another human being ill, perhaps mortally ill, would be a grave and serious ethical wrong. Don't be so self-centered, they tell us. Don't kill your granny. The message is an attractive one, superficially anyway. First, because it's simple, and secondly, because it is based upon a moral precept that we all agree with, that it is unjust and heartless and wrong to fail to protect someone from harm when we've got the power to do so. Why must we accept all the extensive new legal restrictions and limits upon our life? Because, the COVID suppressionist would say, traditional morality and common decency requires us to. You must obey the code, they say, and they injunct us all to stay indoors, protect the NHS, and save lives. So that's the case that I want to subject to some scrutiny and see whether it, appealing as it is on first hearing it, see whether it is a valid ethical position or not. And at this point, I'm going to introduce you to Auntie Joan. Not literally, she's not here with me. For obvious reasons, she's not allowed to be. But Auntie Joan is going to feature quite heavily in this talk. Now, and you'll see what I mean when I say that everybody has an Auntie Joan. You all have somebody in your lives who is like this. My Auntie Joan is in her 80s. She recently survived breast cancer. She lives alone, she always has done, in a very small house in Sunderland. She's from an extremely poor background. She's never had much to call her own. Away from the Catholic Church, she has a very limited social and family life. When I was growing up, a long time ago, my Auntie Joan showed me a great deal of kindness and love. And I regard it as my duty to show her some kindness and some love now. I want to take reasonable steps to see that she doesn't suffer unnecessarily from loneliness, from isolation, from lack of human contact, and so on. I want to bring her some pleasure and some happiness when I can. I think it's my duty to do these things because the code tells me to. Nobody reasonable listening to this, and nobody sane would deny that I should call on her when I can, that I should visit her and take my young children, that I should take her a small gift, that I should make sure she's not starved of human affection, of human touch, of company, stimulation, and so on. Now, I'm not a perfect nephew, and I don't always live up to the code. I live 3 hours away from Sunderland. My life is busy. My visits are too infrequent and too short at the best of times. The truth is I call in on Auntie Joan whenever I'm in the northeast, and I'm usually there for another reason, typically to visit closer relations or perhaps on business. But I believe that when I do take the effort and time to make a visit, I create a small but virtuous circle. So I like to believe that when I visit Auntie Joan, I cheer her up. She enjoys playing with the children. She enjoys having a cup of tea and a piece of cake with my wife and me. We talk, we laugh, we spend an hour or so together, we hug one another and we say goodbye. And afterwards I feel lifted. I feel relieved that she's okay. There's a small worry gone and a small bit of nephew's guilt gone. Perhaps I'm a better human being as the result of a visit to my Auntie Joan's. Perhaps I'm better able to contribute to society when I'm less troubled by the anxiety and the guilt of a neglected elderly aunt. Perhaps it makes me a better husband, dad, boss, friend. Perhaps in turn that makes my wife, my children, my colleagues and my friends a little bit happier. Perhaps a small but virtuous circle is created every time I make the effort to visit my Auntie Joan. I believe it is. I believe that's why the code teaches us not to neglect our Auntie Jones. And of course, you'll have realised that the law presently does not permit me to visit my Auntie Joan. And now we get to the heart of the problem. You see, the same basic decency that bids me to visit Auntie Joan also tells me to stay away from her, in case I do her harm. I'm commanded by the same traditional morality to protect her from isolation and at the same time to ensure quite literally that she is completely isolated. Two separate duties under the code come into conflict with one another. So we need to ask the question of ethics. How do we resolve that conflict? Which provision of the code should we breach? At this point, the COVID suppressionist says, isn't it obvious? You must deprive your auntie of the pleasure of tea and cake with you, rather than risk depriving her of the whole of the rest of her life. If you have to live with a little extra worry and guilt as a consequence, then so be it. On one side of the scales is her right to life. On the other, her pleasure in drinking tea with you. You'd have to be a monster, the COVID suppressionist says, to choose the tea and cake. Again, this is simple. It's a clear and it's a compelling argument on first sight. But does it stack up? Let's think about what's really on each side of the scales. Is it really Auntie Joan's whole life versus tea and cake with her nephew? Or is it more complicated than that? Of course, what's really on one side of the scales isn't Auntie Joan's life itself. It's rather a small risk that she might catch a viral infection from me. So far as I can tell, excuse me, and I'm not a statistician, but I've tried to do this exercise diligently. If I was to visit Auntie Joan once a week, which in reality I would probably never do, maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of this winter, the chances of me transmitting the pathogen to Auntie Joan would be something like 1%, right? Overall, not per visit, overall, if I went once a week. And if that was to happen, the probability that she might die once infected by me would be below 3%. So, by my calculation, a weekly cup of tea over the next year or so, if I did it for a year, would create something like a 0.03% statistical chance that she might die as a direct result. So, again, by my calculation, if I wanted to be absolutely certain of killing you, sorry Auntie Joan if you watch this, I'd have to visit once a week for around 3,500 years. Auntie Joan's 81 years old, and I think average life expectancy in the UK is about 81 years and 2 months, so do the sums. And don't forget, there are many steps that she and I could take, and that we would take, to mitigate and manage that risk still further. With a whole range of reasonable precautions, that risk could be made vanishingly small. So no, we don't put Auntie Joan's whole life on the one side of the scales. If we're going to be honest about this and try to weigh the matter in the balance sincerely, we must put a fractional, immeasurably small risk of her death on the scales instead. Here the COVID suppressionist will say, aha, but you're forgetting that if we open society up, then many hundreds of thousands of Auntie Joans, because we've all got an Auntie Joan, will be subjected to millions of visits by nephews and nieces. Many will get ill, some will die. To do this ethical exercise properly, they say, you must put every Auntie Joan in the land on one side of the scale. Okay, very well, let's do that. Let's be straightforward and say it outright. If we COVID permissivists get what we want, some people will die as a direct result. We must be honest too. We are arguing in favour of a public policy that will result in the premature deaths of a not insignificant number of people. And I think we have to be straight about that. But here I have to interrupt the flow of my argument, and I have to talk about choice. Because you see, we COVID permissivists, we are not asking for the government to force Auntie Joan to eat cake with me or to play with my children. We are asking that she be given the choice to do so, if she wants to, with or without whatever precautions and safeguards she decides upon. You must not say that we want to roll the dice with the health of others. That isn't an honest or fair criticism to make of us. All we ask is that the elderly and the vulnerable are given the legal right to take risks, and quite remote risks so far as I can tell, if they wish to do so. What moral right do you have to refuse to allow an 81-year-old woman to take a 0.03% chance of dying if she freely chooses to because she believes it's in her own interests? What precept of traditional ethics do you rely upon to make such an extraordinary demand of a stranger? Why do you believe you ought to be able to punish her with criminal sanction if she prefers to break out of the half-life of COVID purgatory and start to live again? Why are you so confident that you're right and she's wrong? I'm not familiar with the moral injunction you rely upon as authority for that outlandish contention. I can't find an ethical rule that says, you must prohibit others from taking small and considered risks with their own health. I can't find that written anywhere. It isn't an injunction that I can find in the teachings of any mainstream ethical code, whether ancient or modern, whether Eastern or Western, whether religious or secular. My question to you is, where did you get it from? Where did you get this idea from, that you can do that to somebody else? Let's remember also that I said at the start, when I was characterising the two different positions of the COVID suppressionists and the COVID permissivists, I said that we want certain measures to be in place to protect the vulnerable. Not only do we want to return basic human freedom to the Auntie Jones of this world, we want to provide them with support too. We don't believe that the threat of criminal sanction is what the elderly and the frail need right now in this time of a pandemic. We say that what they need is help and support. Our position is not that their lives should be traded, gambled or tossed away, but that the state should focus all of its power, its might and its resources upon keeping them safe and well. What the safety measures to protect the vulnerable might look like, we'll all have our own ideas about that. It's really beyond the scope of this talk. But we, in my camp, believe that it's not beyond the wit of a country like ours to devise and implement measures that would keep vulnerable citizens reasonably safe and reasonably free, whilst allowing the rest of us to get on with our lives and to do our duty. But here's one example of something we could do for vulnerable people, right? We could give them money, right? Lots of it. We could give them lots of money if we weren't spending it all on enforcing lockdown laws, on compensating employees who are forced to sit at home, on compensating business owners for the compulsory closure of their companies, and so forth. Right? Money might not compensate for the absence of human touch. I know it doesn't. But better to be alone and comfortably off than alone and poor. And of course, the welfare state can only do its job at all if the economy is permitted to function. The well should work so that the sick and the vulnerable can be properly looked after? It's far from clear to me how the forced closure of business is intended to help the vulnerable. How about this? Perhaps the biggest threat ever to the very existence of the welfare state is the twisted ethics of the COVID suppressionists. So a slight risk, which people can mitigate to make vanishingly small, a risk which we only say people can take voluntarily, and a risk which is taken within the broader context of wider public health and welfare state measures. That's the position we are arguing in favour of. The ethical precept on your side of the scales isn't do no harm. That's a maxim I recognise. That's a maxim I heartily endorse. Considered carefully, what ethical precept do you have left to put on your side of the scales? It's not even clear to me that you have a single recognisable ethical precept to appeal to as the moral authority for your outlandish proposition that a healthy adult should be quarantined and isolated against their wishes. So what about the other side of the scales? What about our side of the scales? What should we put on there? I've said that every time I take tea and cake with Auntie Joan, I believe I help to create a small but virtuous circle. Criminal law presently stamps that virtuous circle out before it's come into existence. The happiness and the good order created by that virtual circle never comes into being. It's just one small example of the creation of a virtuous circle that's now outlawed. There are many others. Even in my own life, I could name you hundreds. I have a number of people like Auntie Joan in my life for a start. So, off the top of my head, and in no particular order, here are some other virtuous circles that are stamped out by the legal restrictions presently in force across some or all of the UK. Friendship and family support. How can I even begin to set out the rewards we all receive from spending time with friends and family? The love, the stimulation, the comfort, the correction, the happiness, the laughter, the touching, the breaking of bread together. What is life for if it's not for this? Every moral code ever written bids me to be merry with my friends. Sorry, I'm a little bit emotional in making this talk. Every film I've ever watched, every book I've ever read, they celebrate human togetherness. Every encounter with family and friends sets in motion a virtuous circle of good. The good that close human contact and association does in this world is immeasurable. It's beyond words, it's certainly beyond my words. So let's start by putting all of that on our side of the scales. What about the physical care needs of elderly relatives and neighbours? How many virtuous circles are started when children play with one another and grow together and meet new friends? What about justice in our legal system? Our courts are largely closed. Cases are delayed. Justice is denied. Does that matter? Should we sacrifice the rule of law? Incomprehensible body of COVID law, making many decent citizens into accidental criminals? £10,000 fines? Does that matter? What about justice in our politics? What about the role of Parliament in scrutinising and managing the exercise of executive governmental power? What about democracy itself? Does that matter? What about justice in our constitutional order? What about the fact that we have a Prime Minister on the television threatening to set the army to enforce these laws? Or at least to support the police in doing so? What about the importance of education? Does that not matter? Learning, development of children. You could add to that, of course, the careers of young people who need to be around colleagues to learn. What about art and entertainment and football and theatre and cinema and fun? What about people in our care homes who never have anybody to come and see them anymore? How terrible is that? What about children trapped in loveless homes, denied the usual precious little outside support they get? What about people not getting medical care, not getting diagnoses, not getting pain relief? We have a lot to put on our side of the scales. These are all things that matter. Let's try and think of it this way. Let's try and think about your life. What's it worth? How many virtuous circles would you happily extinguish to prolong your life for a year? How much of others' happiness and well-being would you demand be spent to buy you a little extra safety? Would 100 small virtual circles be worth crushing to prolong your life for a month? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? What about 1,000,000? Of course, we can't do an arithmetic calculation. But there must come some point when we all acknowledge that the happiness and fulfillment of others is worth more than the endless prolongation of our own existence. I don't know of any ethical precept in the code that tells me that the happiness and the well-being of everybody else is subordinate to my right to longevity of existence. If this is the moral rule that COVID suppressionists rely upon, then let me tell them this. It is an eccentric and outlandish moral rule. It has no familiar antecedent in any civilized society. I'm yet to meet the 80-year-old British citizen who believes that all children should be kept indoors so that he or she can live a little bit longer. Most British people are decent. Most follow the code. Almost all. The old and the sick might be vulnerable. They might be frightened. They might want us to make reasonable adjustments to our lives to hinder the virus. That's all fine, but I do not believe that the majority of them want all of our lives to be placed in deep freeze so that theirs can be extended. I don't recognise those people. The vast majority of the older people who I know would no more want to destroy the happiness and the social development of the young than they would want to harvest their organs. Here's my criticism of COVID suppressionism, my ethical criticism of it. You have taken one ethical precept, the precept that we should not inflict avoidable harm upon others, and you've claimed that it sits on your side of the scales. As I've already shown you, that precept is of dubious applicability anyway, because what you really mean is that vulnerable people should be prohibited by threat of criminal sanction from taking measured health risks. That's what you really mean. But even if I'm generous and I allow you to have that ethical precept on your side of the scales, then I say this, that precept also is on my side of the scales. And every other identifiable ethical precept known to basic decency also sits on my side of the scales and not on yours. The question then arises as to the reasonableness of your position. Is it right to take one maxim from the code and to reject every other? If the remaining maxims have no authority, what's the authority of the one that you've opted to retain? If the one you've opted to retain has authority, why have the others no authority? So a COVID suppressionist might urge us to get rid of what he might call our ordinary social obligation to protect Auntie Joan from loneliness, neglect and sadness. He might claim it's not fit for these extraordinary times. He tells us we must accept that the preservation of vulnerable lives is the sole end of everything. Well, his system clashes with mine and with traditional morality at the point, for example, where he criminalises elderly people who choose to cuddle their grandchildren or to take tea with their nephew. The duty of preserving the lives of vulnerable people has no other source than that same tradition that instructs me to attend to the social, the practical, and the emotional needs of the elderly and the frail. If, as the COVID suppressionist wants me to believe, I've been misled by the moral tradition when it taught me my duty to my relatives and my neighbours, is it? He says I've been misled about all that. It doesn't apply anymore. Right. Well, so who is the moral outlier? Which of us has the eccentric and the deviant ethical code? You say that all of the code has no applicability anymore. Traditional morality, gone, counts for nothing anymore. Why are you so certain that you occupy the moral high ground when what you openly advocate is that we burn to cinders every recognisable rule of conduct that humankind has ever lived by? I think the COVID suppressionist can be compared, for example, to a fanatical nationalist who tells me, right, I've got to throw away my duty of universal benevolence to all humankind, and I've got to adopt a system in which nothing but the wealth and the power and the well-being of my own country matters. But my answer to the fanatical nationalist is this. I learned that I have a special duty to my country in the same place where I learned that I have a general duty to all humankind. If the code, the moral tradition, basic decency, call it what you will, if the code was wrong about the one duty, on what ground could a nationalist ask me to believe it was right about the other duty? What the COVID suppressionist is actually doing is creating a whole new morality by contracting the old code into just one ethical rule and stripping away all the others. He wants to retain just one traditional precept and reject all the others. In all our lives and in our collective life together as a country, particular circumstances set a temporary excessive value on one goal. At present, the circumstances are that a potentially lethal virus is in circulation. Thus, we are frightened. When we are frightened, it can seem like our personal safety is the only thing worth having. It isn't true, however. There are many other things other than our personal safety that are important and that are worth having. And the code, our standards of basic decency, exists to remind us of this. We must not cast our basic ethical standards aside because we are frightened. It is our duty not to be cowards. It is our duty to be brave. Fear is a strong, controlling and overpowering emotion. The United Kingdom, in my opinion, is in its controlling grip. When our politicians speak to us in this condition, it's not difficult for them to plant into our minds the fatal idea that our personal safety from infection is worth achieving at all costs. They insinuate this idea into our minds sinuously, indirectly, by devious methods, by imperceptible degrees. But of course, avoiding what is for most people mild or even asymptomatic illness is not the only thing worth having in this life. And nor is freedom from infection worth having at any cost. If we make the suppression of the virus our only real objective, and that is stated government strategy at present, we will necessarily find ourselves with a wildly eccentric and dangerous moral system. a system which not only sanctions but compels us to inflict harm upon others, a system which not only encourages us to neglect our most basic duties of care to our family and friends and to others, but which sanctions us if we show any kindness or love to others. This is the ethical system openly promoted and peddled by the COVID suppressionists. It is not a new morality I welcome. It is a mutilated and grotesque distortion of the old code, in which almost every moral obligation with which we are familiar is sacrificed on the altar of our own personal well-being and longevity. The politicians and the public health officials demand that we exchange the code of basic decency for their new mutilated ethics. They say we must neglect every duty taught to us by our parents and our teachers, by our heroes and our friends in our stories and in our films. I abhor this new morality. It deprives us of our full humanity. The activity of the COVID suppressionists, like the activity of anyone who rejects the code, who rejects basic decency, their activity is directed against our freedom and it's directed against our humanity. It's not the virus that they will end up suppressing, it's us.